Catholic Answers recently came out with an AI Catholic apologist, and since I know a thing or two about the arguments for the existence of God, I figured I'd try it out and see what this guy has to say. So, with that, let's dive into it. Hi, does God exist?
Yes, my friend, God indeed exists. The Catholic Church teaches us that God's existence can be known with certainty through his works, but especially through the divine revelation he has given us.
How can we know by reason that God exists?
A wonderful question.
The Catholic Church teaches that we can come to know of God's existence through natural reason by observing the world around us. St. Paul writes in his letter to the Romans 1 verse 20, "For since the creation of the world God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." This means that by observing the order, beauty, and complexity of the universe, we can infer the existence of a creator. This is known as the argument from design.
Wait, what?
There are also philosophical arguments, such as the argument from causality, which states that everything in the universe has a cause, and this chain of causes must ultimately lead back to a first cause, which we call God. However, while reason can lead us to acknowledge God's existence, it is through faith and revelation that we come to know him personally and intimately.
Can you give an argument which shows, from reason alone, that God exists?
One of the most famous arguments for God's existence is the cosmological argument, particularly the version known as the argument from contingency. This argument, rooted in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, goes as follows. 1. Everything in the world is contingent, meaning it could either exist or not exist, and its existence is caused by something else. 2. If everything is contingent, then at some time there could have been nothing, because something that does not have to exist at some point did not exist. 3. But if there was ever a time when there was nothing, there would still be nothing now, because nothing cannot cause something. 4. Therefore, there must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent on anything else, who always existed and will always exist. This necessary being we call God. This argument uses reason alone and does not rely on any religious texts or divine revelation. It's a philosophical demonstration of God's existence.
So that was just a version of Aquinas' Third Way, which I've covered on a video on this channel. There are other contingency arguments out there which use different premises, and I thought that's where he was going at first, but he did seem to stick closer to Aquinas' language. So I'm going to see if he can maybe give another argument. Can you give another argument for the existence of God?
Certainly, another well-known argument is the teleological argument, or the argument from design. This argument observes the order, purpose, and beauty in the world and concludes that such design implies a designer. 1. We observe that the universe operates according to specific laws and constants that allow for the existence of life.
Fine-tuning.
For example, if the force of gravity were only slightly different, stars and planets could not form, and life as we know it would be impossible. 2. This order and fine-tuning is either due to chance, necessity, or design. 3. It is not due to necessity, because the laws and constants of the universe could have been different. 4. It is incredibly unlikely to be due to chance, given the precision of the fine-tuning. 5. Therefore, the best explanation is that it is due to design, implying the existence of a designer, whom we call God. This argument is based on reason and observation of the world, not on scripture or religious teaching.
What he just gave was a version of the fine-tuning argument, which notices how, in order for life to exist, a certain amount of really, really specific conditions have to be met. I once heard it said that the conditions for the development of life being met in the universe is about the same as the odds of pulling one specific atom out of the many, 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 many atoms in the universe. It's tremendously low. But note that there's still that possibility in there. So this argument, fine-tuning argument, can't give an absolute certainty that God exists. So I'm gonna press him on that a bit. But even there, in the fine-tuning argument, it seems that it's possible that God could not exist, right?
The fine-tuning argument, like all arguments for God's existence, is not meant to be a definitive proof in the mathematical sense,
Oh, interesting.
but rather a strong indication or evidence pointing towards the existence of God.
That's not right.
It suggests that the best explanation for the precise order and laws of the universe, which allow for the existence of life, is an intelligent designer. However, as with any argument, it is possible to raise objections or propose alternative explanations. For example, some might suggest the existence of multiple universes, with ours just happening to have the right conditions for life. Yet,
do say that.
this raises further questions, such as why there should be multiple universes and why they should vary in their laws and constants. Ultimately, while reason can lead us towards God, it is through faith that we come to a full and personal knowledge of Him.
The most interesting part of what he just said is what he said at the beginning. He said that the fine-tuning argument doesn't try to show mathematically that God must exist. And I think he even said that every argument for the existence of God doesn't try to give an absolute certainty that God exists. But I don't think that's true. I would say something like Aquinas' second way, the argument from the distinction between essence and existence, or Aristotle's argument for motion, tries to be a logical demonstration that God must exist. It tries to show with 100% certainty that God exists. So I'm going to ask him about that. Would you say that there are arguments for the existence of God which show with 100% certainty that God exists?
The Catholic Church teaches that we can know with certainty of God's existence through natural reason.
Okay.
However, this certainty is not the same as mathematical or empirical certainty. Rather, it's a philosophical or metaphysical certainty based on sound reasoning and the principles of causality and contingency, among others. The arguments for God's existence, such as the cosmological argument or the argument from design, provide strong, rational grounds for belief in God. They show that belief in God is reasonable and coherent with our experience of the world. But these arguments, while powerful, do not compel belief.
What do you mean that the arguments for the existence of God don't give us mathematical certainty that God exists?
When we say that the arguments for God's existence do not provide mathematical certainty, we mean that they are not like a mathematical proof where, given a certain set of axioms, a particular conclusion is inevitable. The arguments for God's existence are inductive and metaphysical in nature. They take what we know from our experience of the world, such as the existence of contingent beings, the order and regularity of nature, the existence of moral values, and reason from these to the existence of a necessary, intelligent, and moral source of all being, which we call God. These arguments provide strong, rational grounds for belief in God, but they do not compel belief in the way that a mathematical proof does.
But if the premises of the argument are true and the logic is sound, shouldn't an argument for the existence of God give the same kind of mathematical truth that is found in, say, a mathematical equation?
You're correct in stating that if the premises of an argument are true and the logic is sound, then the conclusion should follow necessarily. This is the nature of deductive reasoning. However, arguments for the existence of God, while often presented in a deductive form, are based on metaphysical and philosophical principles, which are not as easily verifiable as mathematical or empirical facts. For example, the premise that everything that exists has a cause, or that there is order and design in the universe, is not something we can prove with mathematical certainty, but rather something we infer from our experience and understanding of the world. Therefore, while these arguments provide strong, rational grounds for belief in God, they do not compel belief in the way that a mathematical proof does.
Did he just say that everything that exists needs a cause? Is a premise for one of the arguments for the existence of God? I think what he meant to say is that everything which begins to exist has a cause, because the whole point of all of the arguments for the existence of God is to show that there is something which exists which doesn't have a cause. I think I'm going to ask him about that. Did you just say that one of the premises used to show the existence of God is that everything which exists requires a cause?
I apologize if I misspoke. The principle of causality, as used in arguments for God's existence, is often stated as everything that begins to exist has a cause.
There we go.
Or contingent beings require a cause.
Or
This is different from saying everything that exists has a cause. The distinction is important because God, as traditionally understood in Catholic theology, did not begin to exist but rather exists necessarily and eternally. Therefore, God does not require a cause. This is a key point in the cosmological argument, which reasons from the existence of contingent beings to a necessary, uncaused being, which we call God. As it says in Revelation 1 verse 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty.
Yeah, that makes more sense, what he was getting at, because every argument for the existence of God, at least every metaphysical argument for the existence of God, tries to show from some reality in the world that there exists something which doesn't need a cause, which just is, and that thing is God. So, okay, I guess what I'll do now is I'll ask him about one specific argument for the existence of God that I find interesting. I'll ask him about Aristotle's argument for motion. Can you please summarize Aristotle's argument for the existence of God, the argument for motion?
Certainly, Aristotle's argument for the existence of God, often referred to as the argument for motion, is a classic philosophical argument. Here's a simplified version. 1. We observe that things in the world are in motion. 2. Everything that is in motion is moved by something else. This is based on the principle that something cannot move itself. 3. This leads to a chain of movers, each one moved by something else. 4. However, this chain cannot go on to infinity. There must be a first mover that is not itself moved by anything else. 5. This unmoved mover we understand to be God. Aristotle's argument is not based on a beginning in time, but rather on the hierarchical ordering of movers here and now. He concludes that there must be a first mover that initiates motion, but is not itself moved, a sort of prime mover. This argument is one of the ways that philosophers and theologians have used reason and observation to argue for the existence of God.
That was a good summary. I think that argument works, but I think it can be built upon, and I think there are objections that people have offered that I would like to see how Justin here reacts to. So let me pose an objection to him. How can we know that the causal series of movers moving things while themselves being moved can't go back to infinity?
Aristotle's argument, often referred to as the argument for motion, posits that there must be a first mover, or prime mover, that initiates motion but is not itself moved. The reason for this is based on the principle of causality and the impossibility of an infinite regress of moved movers. Here's the reasoning. If every mover is itself moved, then to account for any motion, we have to refer to a previous mover. But if we then have to account for the motion of that mover and the mover before that, and so on ad infinitum, we never arrive at a satisfactory explanation for why there is any motion at all. The series of movers cannot go back infinitely. There must be a first mover that is not itself moved by anything else. This is similar to the principle that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. There must be a first cause, or else we would never have an explanation for why there is anything rather than nothing.
Right. In other words, if the chain of movers went back infinitely and none of those movers had the power in itself to move anything, and only got that power to move something derived from something else, then we would have no explanation for how anything is moving right now. It would be like a chandelier hanging from a ceiling, except there's nothing that actually touches the ceiling. There would be nothing to explain how the chandelier is hanging in the air right now. So now I'm going to tackle another argument for the existence of God and see what this guy has to say about it. The argument from morality. Please explain the argument from moral realism for the existence of God.
The moral argument for the existence of God is a powerful one. It begins with the observation that we all recognize some moral code, that some things are right and some things are wrong.
Sure.
This is what we call moral realism, the belief that there are objective moral truths that exist independently of our perception of them. The argument goes like this. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. The first premise is based on the idea that without a transcendent, objective standard, which would be God, all we are left with are subjective human opinions. Without God, moral values would be nothing more than the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. The second premise is something that we intuitively know to be true. We all recognize that some things, like torturing children for fun, are objectively wrong. It's not just a matter of personal opinion. Therefore, if both premises are true, the conclusion follows logically and inescapably. God exists.
Okay.
This argument does not tell us which conception of God is true, but it does suggest that atheism cannot be true. It is consistent with the Christian understanding of God as a moral lawgiver.
I think it did a good job covering the argument. Basically, what it's saying is we know that some things are objectively good or bad. How do we know this? Well, we know from our intuitions, right? If I killed my friend would get he'd be dead. So that's a bad example. But if I killed my friend's friends would get really mad at me. And what would they say? They'd say, Thomas, why'd you kill Charlie? He didn't deserve it. And then I'd say, well, what do you mean he didn't deserve it? Why does that matter? And they'd say, no, it's just wrong to kill someone when he doesn't deserve it. It's just wrong. You can't do that. I said, why not? I thought it would be fun. They said, no, you can't do something that's fun just because it's fun. There are some things that are just wrong. That's an intuition we all have. And I could find other examples, but that's a pretty obvious one. Don't kill people for fun. Okay. An objective moral statement can't be grounded in our personal opinions because our opinions are changing and subjective. So it must be grounded in something above our opinions. It must be grounded in something which really just has to be goodness itself, because anything objective must be grounded in an objective standard. So when Justin here says that the argument for morality doesn't give us the Christian God, I think I would push back a bit. I would say that it gives us a God that's all good. So it gives us the God of classical theism, because something that's all good also has to be being itself, because goodness and being are interchangeable. So the argument for morality gives us a God which is all good, all knowing, all powerful, all loving, infinite being, perfectly simple. See my video on that for the finer points of the argument. But he did a good job summarizing it. Okay, I appreciate that. I guess now what I'll turn to is some of the arguments for atheism, to see what he has to say on the other side of things. Let's take the argument from the problem of evil, for example. The argument which says that because there's evil in the world, superfluous evil, an all-good and all-powerful God can't exist, because an all-good and all-powerful God would try to prevent evil, and because he's all-powerful, he would have the power to do that. So let's see what Justin says in response to that. If God is all good, why does he allow evil to exist?
This is a question that has been asked by many throughout history. The existence of evil is not a denial of God's goodness, but rather a consequence of the gift of free will. God created us with the ability to choose, and unfortunately, some choose to do evil. As it says in Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live. However, God does not abandon us in the face of evil. He is always there, offering us his love and grace, and working to bring good out of even the worst situations. Moreover, the existence of evil and suffering allows for the possibility of virtues such as courage, patience, and compassion. It is often through our struggles that we grow and mature in our faith.
So God allows evil, he's saying, in order to bring about goods that couldn't exist if evil didn't exist. Like courage. You couldn't have courage if there was nothing to be courageous in the face of. You couldn't have bravery if there's nothing to be brave around. You couldn't have charity if people didn't lack something, right? Because in order to give you something from charity, you have to lack something that I can give you. So, okay, I see where he's going. What's a good way to go about this next one? Let's see. I think I'm gonna push back a bit. Let's say, how do we know that God always brings greater good out of evil? I'll ask him that. How do we know that God always brings greater good out of evil, and that some evil isn't superfluous?
This is a profound question. As Catholics, we believe that God, in his infinite wisdom and power, can bring good out of even the most tragic situations. This belief is rooted in Scripture and in the teachings of the Church. In the book of Genesis, for instance, Joseph tells his brothers, who had sold him into slavery, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives," Genesis 50 verse 20. In the New Testament, the ultimate example of God bringing good out of evil is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. His death, a terrible act of violence, brought about the salvation of the world. As St. Paul writes in Romans 5 verse 20, "Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more." However, it's important to remember that God does not cause evil or suffering. He respects our free will, even when we misuse it. But he is always there, ready to bring good out of even the worst situations. As St. Augustine wrote, God judged it better to bring good out of evil than to suffer no evil to exist. In the face of suffering, we are called to trust in God's providence and to cooperate with his grace. We may not always understand why certain things happen, but we can be confident that God is with us and that he is working for our good. As it says in Romans 8 verse 28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Of course, this doesn't mean that we should passively accept evil or injustice. On the contrary, we are called to be co-workers with God in bringing about his kingdom of justice, peace, and love. As St. Teresa of Avila famously said, "Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours."
You know, I do think an AI Catholic apologist is a good idea. But there's definitely some work that needs to be done. I think that entire argument was just citing authorities. And it also didn't really answer my question. My question was, how do we know from reason that there isn't some evil which is not there to bring on a greater good? Maybe he didn't get the from reason part. Maybe I should make that more clear. Is there a way we can know from reason alone that God allows evil to bring about a greater good?
This is indeed a complex question. From a purely philosophical perspective, we can reason that if there is a God who is all-powerful and all-good, then he would not allow evil to exist unless there was a way to bring good out of it. This is known as the principle of sufficient reason. However, it's important to note that while reason can lead us to this conclusion, it is ultimately faith that gives us the assurance of this truth. So, while reason can guide us towards understanding the relationship between God, good, and evil, it is faith that allows us to trust in God's promise to bring good out of even the most difficult circumstances.
Okay, I think I see what he's getting at. If we can know from reason that God exists, and he said that we can, we covered that, and that God must be all good, and he must be all powerful, then if we know all those things are true, it can't be the case that God doesn't exist, or God isn't all good, or God isn't all powerful. So we must say that any evil in the world is ultimately to bring about a greater good. I think that makes sense. Someone else might want to push back on that, but I think that makes sense. There have been many different things that we've called God over the years. Zeus, Poseidon, Odin, all those other random ones that I don't know. How do we know, since we know those guys don't exist, how do we know that the Christian God is different and that he does exist?
As it says in Hebrews 3 verse 4, "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." The teleological argument, on the other hand, points to the order and complexity in the universe as evidence of a designer. As Psalm 19 verse 1 declares, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Finally, the moral argument posits that the existence of objective moral values points to a moral lawgiver, who we understand to be God. These arguments, while not providing a complete understanding of God, do provide a rational basis for belief in God. However, to know God as he has revealed himself in Jesus Christ requires faith, a gift that God freely offers to all.
So in other words, the arguments for the existence of God, the philosophical arguments for the existence of God that he's been talking about in this video. Things like the cosmological argument, the argument for motion, the argument from design, the argument from morality. These arguments show the existence of a God who must be all good, all loving, all knowing, all powerful, all simple, perfectly existent, being itself. It shows the existence of that God. But Zeus or Poseidon or all these other claims of things that people say are God, they don't have those attributes. So Zeus can't really be God in the sense that these arguments prove. These arguments show that something exists which looks more like the Christian God than it does like these other God claims. That's why it's not absurd to say, I believe in God, but to say I don't believe in these other things that people have claimed to be God. Well, I guess that was all I really wanted to ask Justin, the Catholic AI apologist, today. He made some good points. I think there are some finer points that could be tuned up. He spends a lot of time talking about arguments from authority. He really insists on some of the more modern arguments for God, like the argument from fine-tuning and the argument for morality. I'm actually surprised he didn't draw more on, say, Aquinas' 5 ways, or something like the Neoplatonic argument for the existence of God. Some of those more classical arguments for God. But I guess it's not that surprising because they do take a lot of work to figure out sometimes. But, I think a couple years down the line, AI Catholic apologists might be springing up everywhere. Who knows? Maybe me and my online summaries of the existence of God channel will go out of business, be put out of business by Justin, the Catholic AI apologist. Who knows? Anyway,